Welcome to another Star Mini-Gaming YouTube video. As always, I'm James, and if I look tired, it's because it's entirely too early or late, depending on how you look on it. It's about 1 a.m., and rather than go to bed like a sensible human being, I love you all too much, and I just had to make another video, right? Have to keep pouring out content. For the community to enjoy while you're painting or whatever else it may be. If you're like myself, I don't watch much TV. I watch the different Warhammer YouTubers and the like, and so I always appreciate it. So I figured, you know what, put it out for everyone else who does the same. So this is a video about Age of Sigmar, of course, and I was thinking the other day how so many people have talked about how Age of Sigmar was a bit of a gamble for GW, and they're partially right. Obviously, kind of finishing off the dying beast that was fantasy from a business perspective. Not I'm not saying the game was bad or anything. I'm just saying purely from a numbers perspective, from a company the size of GW, Warhammer Fantasy was no longer viable. I've talked to my trade representative, who's fairly high up on the company, or actually he's not mine, but I guess the head of the trade representative department for this part of the world. And he told me personally that Warhammer Fantasy, as I've said before in other videos, accounted for about 1% of their annual sales, which is nothing to a company like that. Less than their paints, less than their hobby supplies, obviously less than 40K, less than their books, less than everything. Warhammer Fantasy, the models, the rules, the game itself was next to the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit, their smallest seller. And actually, with that, it was comparable in size. They were both roughly even. But anyways, relaunching the game from purely a game perspective was a bit of a risk. It's a new product. You're getting rid of something that is beloved by a community, and you have to ask yourself, will they hate this replacement product and more blame the product and be like, that's the reason why the thing that I love is no longer around? Or be angry with the company and be like, the company replaced the thing that I love, so I don't care about them anymore, I don't support them, I go elsewhere? Or would they say, this is similar, it's within the same world, the same fluff, it continues the story, my favorite characters are in here, there's aspects of the game that are similar, whatever it might be, and decide, let's stick with this. And that was a risk. But here's where Age of Sigmar is not a risk, and is the most brilliant thing GW has ever done. So let's, for now, set aside what anyone thinks about the gameplay of Age of Sigmar and the game itself, because the game itself is not important to this thought process. Let's look real briefly at the story. As you know, I love the story of Age of Sigmar. Story is what gets me into anything. I love Star Wars, especially the formerly known as the Expanded Universe, now just known as Dead. And that, it's the story that got me into the love of Star Wars. The story is what gets me into everything, at least for an extended period of time. And it's what gets me passionate about things. But Age of Sigmar's story is not set immediately after the end times. Age of Sigmar is set hundreds to thousands of years after the end times. So what we have is a new setting and a new story with a massive gap that is barely defined in between the old world and what we currently have. Now, where have we seen in GW's history a game that has a massive gap before the kind of current time that the game takes place in? The answer is, of course, Warhammer 40k. If you're at all familiar with Warhammer 40k, you know that in the story of Warhammer 40k, there's kind of two sections of fluff that precede it. There's the loose fluff on, like, who is the Emperor really? How did he come to be? How did humanity expand to the stars? How was the Imperium initially created? Things like that that have had different versions of the story throughout time that GW's kind of changed and all. And those are all very minor that, that kind of like are an origins explanation, but for the universe that Warhammer 40k exists in and for the game itself are relatively unimportant. And the big precursor things are obviously Horus Heresy. GW's really began to flesh that out with their novel line. The game already existed through Forge World and is now becoming a bit more mainstream with the Betrayal Account. It's seen a huge spike in sales. It's making GW a lot of money. And even before this, the story wasn't super in depth, but for something that, was just a prior event on a timeline, was pretty well explained compared to other similar, narratives that had just kind of like timeline summaries of what took place before or after. And obviously GW is still diving into 30k to the Horus Heresy time period. It's still pretty early on in terms of making that more mainstream, but it's making them a lot of money. It's a big product. They're doing really well. Betrayal Account was a huge success. The number of boxes that they've sold, including multiples to the same customers, is ridiculous. I had, for my shop, I had only bought 2 boxes simply because it's what funds allowed, and I put them up for sale, and I pre-sold my 2 boxes within 8 minutes of saying, hey, I have these boxes. And that's certainly not unique, that experience. That's what I hear from most of the other retailers in my area that I'm connected with. So, setting up 40k and having these hints at what came before, and then kind of developing the story of what came before, you really appeal to everyone who already was interested in 40, or not necessarily everyone, but to a large group of people who were already interested in 40k, and maybe you even get some people who weren't, that think, wow, that Horus Heresy, that's way more interesting than, the 40k kind of stalemate that's going on. And so GW has already shown, kind of through their own tests that this works, right? 40k was initially a bit of a gimmick or a test. Could they make a game other than Warhammer Fantasy that was successful? And Horus Heresy was initially much the same thing, right? Could we expand 40k in this direction into the past instead of having to always progress the storyline forward and potentially cause, armies to have to be removed or whatever, some kind of cataclysmic event to make the story really gripping? So instead they go backwards on the timeline. And so now with Age of Sigmar, they've done the exact same thing. We have in the novels mentions of the Age of Chaos and the Age of Myth, but these are not really defined. But if you just look at how the story has progressed for the Age of Sigmar, the amount of opportunity for GW to capitalize is huge. I mean, if you followed Warhammer in the old world, and I didn't, but when I first started getting Age of Sigmar a little over a month ago, I really delved into the end times because I said I want to know what happens before this. I want to know what leads up to this. I want to know what sets this up. And watching Kieran's channel and Materim's and Vince's channels, I've gotten, a bit more of a grasp on the story before. And I don't know everything, obviously, but I have a bit of a handle on how the old world story developed, kind of the overall concepts that went on, that Chaos was pretty much always going to win and was the most powerful. And now we have the Age of Sigmar where things are a bit more even. But if you look at the prior ages, you have the opportunity to take it in very different directions. If you want, as GW, GW can take the Age of Chaos, for example, and create a fantasy version of Warhammer 40k. 40k is known as the Grimdark universe, the Grimdark future. And whenever Chaos invades the 8 realms, they didn't get to the realm of heaven where Sigmar was. And these realms begin to fall, and Sigmar shuts off the realm of heaven so that Chaos can't enter and basically leaves everyone else to their fate. That's obviously a really dark time. In some of the novels, such as in the Search for Gal Maraz, in the actual story, whenever Sigmar sends his forces to reclaim Gal Maraz from Tzeentch forces that are holding it, the prologue that describes what befalls this place, this world that has Gal Maraz on it, and its fall to the Tzeentch forces is very dark. I mean, the description of it is people just being wiped out, turned into slaves, just cities being leveled, and these slaves being forced to, out of the rubble, build these new structures for their chaos overlords, like in the Azir, the Gate of Azir book, which is the first one that was written in the first one from a chronological perspective in Age of Sigmar, beginning the war. The prologue of that describes citizens of the Realm of Fire who literally do nothing but run for their lives. They can't fight, they don't have armor or weaponry or numbers to fight Chaos because they've already been defeated and broken. In the Realm Gate Wars audio drama series that I've also been reviewing, that we have 3 of the 4 parts that are already out, and we're awaiting the 4th one at the time of this video to be released. We have Tarsus, the Lord Celestin of the Stormcast, who is remembering being in the Realm of Death before he became a Stormcast, when he was just a mortal. And he remembers falling in combat whenever Chaos invaded. And he remembers falling to a Bloodthirster. And they come across his old city, which was Hellstone, which was this massive city that is now a ghost town. Like, there's no one left alive. There's just crypt ghouls and crypt horrors and chaos forces and skeletons and wights, and that's all that remains of this civilization. And so we have so many opportunities that GW has already written into the story to create a precursor game that really follows the narrative in this very grim, dark time. So obviously that's brilliant by GW. They've looked at 40k and they've said this model has already worked. Now let's try out the game of Age of Sigmar, and if this is wildly successful, and we basically get to the point to where we're like, if we continue to advance the storyline forward significantly at all, then something big is going to have to give, and it's either going to be the destruction of an army or a major character, or basically a point at which we cannot return from without major issues, circa, Storm of Magic or Storm of Chaos or whatever it was back from the old world, where basically the end times almost happened there too. Without something on that level of a retcon, the only option they have is to go backwards in the storyline, and to kind of create a game that is a predecessor from a storyline perspective. And they've already written themselves that in. They already have given themselves that option to Horus Heresy in the Age of Sigmar, which is absolutely brilliant. And if they never get to that point, if Age of Sigmar is not successful and they decide we've given it long enough, we're going to pull the plug, and we're just not going to make a large-scale fantasy game of any sort, which I honestly doubt. To be honest, Age of Sigmar, it will be very hard for it to fail with the way that they've designed it. Not necessarily in the game, but I mean from a purely business perspective. They already have existing models that they've already spent the time and effort to make cast some molds of. The War Scrolls are free, so they don't have to print them. If the army books, the battle tomes, are not successful enough in print form, or even in digital form, they just don't have to make anymore. It would be very hard for Age of Sigmar to fail financially for them. But if it does, then fine. They just never pursue this Horus heresy of the Warhammer world. But if it is wildly successful, then they have given themselves so many more potential outlets to make additional games and additional profit from, which is absolutely brilliant. So I applaud you, GW. So I hope you enjoy that. I hope that gives you some thought on what we're seeing in Age of Sigmar is how well developed their plans have been with this. Feel free to comment below with what you think about what I've just said. Did you notice this before I talked about it? Is this even something that you've thought about? Do you think that's a viable option, or can there only be one, kind of Horus Heresy precursor game? What do you think? Until next time, this is James. Happy gaming.